Hello again, history fans. How are you today? Hope you are doing well. Today we are going to talk about World War II and the Cold War. Uh, Last time we ended by talking about all the way back before the test. Ended by talking about the Great Depression and how life was just incredibly awful in the 1930s decade. FDR's New Deal, we said, had this goal of relief, recovery, and reform, and so it's relief. It's not. It never has the goal of trying to solve the Great Depression necessarily. It's just wanting to get Americans through it until the Great Depression is over. And so during the 1930s decade, the economy just sort of bumps along the bottom until World War II hits. Boom, everything. And World War II is the thing that pulls America out of the Great Depression. World War II is the thing that pulls America out of the Great Depression. We talked about how during the Great Depression, unemployment was at 25%. It's gone now. It's at zero. With the advance of World War II, people are going into the war, into the military. People are going into the war effort. They are going into factories. So, and everybody who wants a job has a job during the Second World War. The Second World War really bleeds into the Cold War and cultural concerns about the Cold War, which we will talk about here in a second. So that's why these two things are kind of together. So first, let's start with World War II. Since this is American history, we're not going to really talk about what's going on with the war itself proper. We are instead going to talk about what is happening at home on the home front. How does the World War II affect people at home? Some people it affects pretty well. They have an expansion of liberties. Some people a marked decrease of liberties, and some people it's kind of a mixed bag. So we're going to look at a lot of different groups and how they are affected by World War II. So our first group that we're going to discuss is African Americans during World War II. African Americans served in very high numbers, per capita speaking, roughly 1 million. During World War II, there is a push for more and more people to go into factory work. Factory work was called blue collar work, and maybe you've heard this before, like people still use these terms, blue collar and white collar work. Blue collar work is manual labor. If you're working outside and you're getting dirty or sweaty or oily or working with machines, that sort of thing, then you don't want to wear nice fancy white collar shirts because they're going to get dirty and they're going to be impossible to keep clean. So they wear blue collared shirts. They're easier to clean. Whereas if you have an office job, an administrative job, a managerial position, then you're in air conditioning all day and you're expected to look a little nicer. And so you can wear the white collar shirt. So blue collar work and white collar work, both of them go up during World War II. More and more African Americans are going into the armed services, but also more and more African Americans are being hired in factory work. As more and more people go into combat roles, then that opens up factory jobs that still need to be done. Somebody's got to make all of the planes and tanks and bullets and guns and everything that the war effort requires. So there's a lot of factory jobs that open up in World War II, and African Americans are some of the first African American men are some of the first people who take advantage of that. However, when they get there, either in the military or in factory work, they face a lot of discrimination. They are always last hired. They are always paid less. They are often segregated, especially in the military, but even in factory work, they're often segregated and are passed up for promotions and aren't allowed to have managerial positions in factory work or officer positions in the military. So because of all of those things, an activist comes on the scene, A. Philip Randolph. So that's his first initial, A. Philip Randolph, that's his name. He threatened President FDR, with a civil rights march on Washington if FDR didn't step up and stick up for African American people in factories and advocate for better hiring practices, better pay. then A. Philip Randolph, would stage a civil rights march on Washington, D.C. Now, this is not an idle threat. A. Philip Randolph was the leader, the labor union president of the Pullman Palace Car Association. That's a lot of P's. That's always so hard for me to say. Pullman Palace Car Association. The Pullman Palace Cars, think back to our discussion of like Gilded Age, 1880s, 1890s. The new railways that were on the scene had Pullman Palace cars that were like railway hotels. It was if you were taking an overnight railway trip, you could rent a room in a Pullman Palace car. And so it wasn't just any room, it was palatial. It was large, it was luxurious, that like the velvet cushions and the chandeliers and all. It was very fancy. And and they had a porter who would watch your luggage and take care of you and bring you a snack at bedtime and all this kind of stuff. And those porters were to a man black. It was a black man's job. Being a Pullman Palace car porter was a job for black men. But at the time, it was seen as a really good job for black men because they got to travel. It was very prestigious. It was white collar work. And so A. Philip Randolph, as the president of the Pullman Palace Car Porters Association, is a very well-respected, very well-known person. And so when he threatens FDR with a march on Washington, FDR knows that he could back that up. He knows that if A. Philip Randolph tried, he could make a really large headache for FDR, and FDR does not want that because a group of racially othered, oppressed people being oppressed by their government, arguing against their government leaders looks eerily similar to stuff that's going on in Germany at the time. And FDR doesn't want people to make those connections. So the important thing about A. Philip Randolph's threat to FDR is that it works. FDR listens. The Civil Rights March on Washington never goes through in World War II in the 1940s. But it doesn't have to, because FDR signs an executive order to stick up for hiring and equal pay practices for African Americans in factory work. Another thing that's happening during World War II with African Americans is that membership in the NAACP increased 9 times during the war. Now, the NAACP is an organization, stands for the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. The National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. Now, this organization had existed for quite some time, but during the war, they get very, very powerful, very, very popular. More and more people than ever are joining and becoming very involved. And so that will set us up for great success in a generation or so when we get to, or in the next module or so, when we get to the 1960s decade. Things are happening for African Americans during the 1940s decade that set up all of those very popular civil rights movements of the 1960s decade that I'm sure we know about. So all of these things, African Americans are joining the military, they're becoming involved in organizations like the NAACP, they have these ideas of civil rights marches, they're becoming more and more involved in advocating for their rights at home, which leads to our last point, the WWII campaign. This poster over here, lots of cool posters out of World War II. We'll look at a couple. This poster over here on the right portrays what African Americans were calling the WWII campaign. It says, this is the enemy. Who is the enemy? Or first and foremost, Nazi Germany. We see a German soldier here. We know he's a Nazi because we see the swastika in his hat. But what is he watching? What is he watching happen? We can see reflected in his monocle a lynching, racial violence against African American people. Now, racial violence, again, has been happening for years by this point, a century. But in the 1940s, there's more and more pushback and more African Americans, as we can see why our discussion of this stuff over here, are starting to become more powerful in pushing back. They're starting to have the avenues to push back against racial violence. And so they are. The Double V campaign. Maybe you've seen those old school photos of Winston Churchill, the Prime Minister of England at the time. He's going like this, putting the two peace signs up, right? Before this was the peace sign, this was V for victory. Get it? Two fingers holding up is a V. So V for victory. People and African American people wanted double V. They want a victory abroad. They want to win the war against Nazi Germany. They're joining the military. They're joining factory work to fight for that. But they also want victory at home. They want to fight against racial violence and oppression. They want to increase their liberties at home. So the double V campaign, victory abroad and victory at home. African Americans are fighting for victory in both of those places. Victory abroad against Nazi Germany, victory at home against racial violence and oppression of their civil rights. Our next group that we're going to talk about during World War II, women. We've probably all seen this poster. Again, just like we said, as more and more men go to war, that opens up more and more factory jobs that need to be completed. And so women are encouraged to go into those factories. And they do in very large numbers. Roughly 6 million women enter blue-collar factory work on the factory floor, manual labor, working as riveters or welders or things like that. 61% of whom were married mothers. 61%, basically 2/3, just under 2/3 of those 6 million were married mothers. This is a big deal for American history. This is the first mass entrance of mothers into the workforce. These women are, like our Rosie the Riveter poster, like I said, doing manual labor, blue collar work. They're doing very physically demanding work. And this is the first time that so many women have done such hard manual labor. And so the United States government, interestingly, puts out a lot of propaganda to first convince American women that they can and that they should. It's portrayed as being American women's patriotic duty to take up the mantle of the factories workers that have been left and make sure that all of that work is continuing. But also, secondly, the American federal government puts out a lot of propaganda to convince American women that they are even better at it than men are. Because there's this big rush for all of that work to be, all of those jobs to be taken, and it should be taken right now. Like, we can't wait around for you to learn how to do this skill for an apprenticeship for 1 or 2 years. You got to do it now. And so the American government spends a lot of time talking about how you've actually already been doing this work. Women are just naturally better at this, just like you sew and embroider. That is the same skill as putting wiring into an airplane. Just the same way that women take cookies out of the oven. It's the same motion for putting the big sheet of metal underneath the body of the airplane. You were doing it the whole time and you just never knew, right? Cutting out a dress pattern is just like cutting out a parachute. And women are just naturally better machinists because they have smaller, nimbler fingers that can reach down into the machines and engines much better than a man can with his big clumsy fingers. So women are just naturally better at all of this stuff. Maybe not. It seems kind of silly in hindsight, but it works. It works. American women enter blue collar labor work in obviously very, very high numbers and are very, very successful. However, when they get there, they do face a lot of inequality just because of their sex. First and foremost, and perhaps most obviously, is unequal pay. Women are always, always, always paid less than a man is for the exact same job. The justification for this is that historically, if women had a job, it was seen as a supplement to her husband's income. Women having a job was something extra. The man was supposed to have a job that provided for his family. The male head of household should be able on his paycheck to let his family thrive. But the problem is that during World War II, these women aren't supplementing their husband's income. They, for all intents and purposes, are the heads of households for their families because their men are gone, right? Their husbands are fighting the war half a world away. So the pay becomes a really big issue. Also, another big problem is that this is an era before daycare. 61% of these Rosies are married mothers, right? They have children. Where do their kids go? A lot of women come up with a lot of clever ways to try to figure out that question. Sometimes they'll get an apartment together and they'll say, okay, you take the day shift and I'll take the night shift and we'll watch each other's kids. Sometimes women, if the kids are a little older, they would just take the kids to work with them and just like roll down the window in the car and leave them in the car. And the kids were just supposed to hang out in the parking lot for 8 hours, feed them a sandwich, and, check on them on your lunch break and hope for the best. If they were older, then they became what were called latchkey kids. Maybe this is some of your parents. The idea is they go to school and they have a house key on their lanyard around their neck inside their shirt, so they could let themselves into their house or apartment after they got home from school. And they were just expected to take care of themselves. Women during World War II who do these sorts of things face a catch-22. They're damned if they do and they're damned if they don't, right? If they go to the factory work, then they're being a bad mother. They're leaving their kids. And we do see, quote unquote, being a bad mother and leaving their kids. And we do see during World War II a marked rise in the numbers of both teen pregnancy and teen delinquency. And so it does seem like when fathers are at war and mothers are in their factory, that kids get up to some sort of trouble. They're getting pregnant and getting each other pregnant and committing crimes and thieving and doing things like that they shouldn't be doing. However, if women take the flip side, if they stay home and they depend on their husband's paycheck to come from a world away and they don't get a job, then they're being bad wives and they're being unsupportive wives and they're being bad patriotic Americans. So there's no winning, right? There's no winning for women entering blue collar work. During World War II, women also enter white collar work in very high numbers, mostly by entering the military. All of the branches of the military during World War II come up with their own auxiliary services, their own women's auxiliaries. So the Army had the WACs, the Women's Auxiliary Corps. The Navy, for example, had the Waves. Get it? Navy had the Waves. So funny. They're so clever. The Women's Auxiliary Volunteer Service, the Waves, is my favorite. These women were engaged in like what we would call administrative assistant sorts of positions. They were typists, radio and telegraph operators doing clerical work. Basically, they're pushing all of the paper that the war requires. All of the administrative tasks. They're answering phones, taking dictation, those sorts of things. Interestingly, this sort of work had previously been seen as a male job, so quote unquote, supposedly, because all of these things are machines. Men are supposed to deal with machines. So typing or working with a radio or a telegraph operator, those are machines. And men are supposed to supposedly be better at machines. And so during World War II, all of the men who are engaged in clerical work for the Army are shuffled into combat roles. All of those jobs still need to be completed. Women are the only ones left. So the WACs and the Waves step up and undergo some very intensive short-term training, enter those jobs. And nowadays, they do it so well, right? That nowadays, these sorts of administrative assistant or secretarial or clerical work jobs and roles are seen as more women's jobs, women's roles. So the WACs and the Waves do it so well that those jobs are always kind of seen as more feminine jobs historically. So over here on the left, we see another cool World War II era poster. Join the WACs, advertising for women to join the military, join white collar work. We see her there in her uniform on her bunk in the army barrack and she's typing on her cool machine and she says, "This is my war too." Now, how might we take that? A few things we might pull out of that. What does that mean? This is my war too. She's an American just like anybody else. She wants to support her country. One way that she can do that is by joining the military. This is my war too. Military isn't just for women anymore, or isn't just for men anymore. It can also be for women. So the Rosies and the Whacks and the Waves, and we see that are very successful, generally speaking. They enter these blue collar and white collar work in very high numbers. The whole goal is that they are supposed to hold these jobs for the men, complete these jobs while the men are otherwise occupied. Well, if that's the goal, then we're going to see a pretty heavy readjustment when the men come home after the war. After the war ends, all of the men come home and they expect their jobs back. And so there is a big push. The government, again, puts out a lot of military propaganda to try to convince women to give up those jobs. It was seen as their patriotic duty to take those jobs, and now it is their patriotic duty to give those jobs back to a returning veteran because he has a family. Keeping a job would be seen as unpatriotic because it's seen as taking a job away from a returning veteran who has earned that job, who has a family to provide for. He's a male head of household, and they're the ones who are supposed to, quote unquote, supposed to have a job to feed their family, provide for their family. So by and large, generally speaking, women do that. Women give their jobs up to returning veterans and they go home, but they do not go home unchanged. They've seen how quickly and how completely gender roles and expectations around gender norms can change. They've seen how women are capable and strong, physically and mentally strong, how women can organize and join labor unions and advocate for equal treatment and higher pay and learn a skill very quickly and very well. They've seen that women can do all of those things. They know that women are capable because they did it. And that's the lesson that they teach their daughters. And it's their daughters who go on a generation later in the 1960s to cause such a ruckus of second wave feminism, which we'll talk about in the next module. So once again, just like with African Americans, we see that women's experiences in World War II are very transformative for them themselves, but they also set up even more transformation a generation later in the 1960s. Things happen in World War II that set up the drama of the 60s. So for those two groups, African Americans and women, there's challenges by all means, but mostly those are positive experiences that come out of World War II. So now let's talk about a couple of experiences that are almost wholly negative. The flip side, the dark side of World War II. If we're thinking about things that go wrong during World War II at home, probably the first thing that we think of is Japanese internment. Japanese Americans during World War II. There had always been a lot of Asian prejudice in the West Coast, but after the attack on Pearl Harbor, it jumps through the roof. So if we're not aware, I guess we kind of skipped over this. The whole reason that the Americans enter World War II is because of the attack on Pearl Harbor. The Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor, which was a naval base in Honolulu, Hawaii, on December 7th, 1941. December 7th, 1941, the bombing of Pearl Harbor in Hawaii. And the very next day, FDR goes before Congress and asks for a declaration of war. He calls that day a day which will live in infamy. And the attack was completely out of left field, completely unexpected. And it's seen as very dirty and very sneaky and very unfair because America was trying to remain neutral. Japan had seemingly, at the time, no reason to attack the United States. And so he got his declaration of war almost unanimously. I think one person abstained from voting because that person was a pacifist and didn't believe in war at all. And so he didn't vote no, but he abstains. So almost overwhelmingly, almost unanimously, a declaration of war against Japan. And very quickly, the alliance system takes over, and all of these different countries say, I declare war on you. And they say, not if I declare war on you first. And everything blows up. And so the US enters World War II. After the attack on Pearl Harbor, Asian prejudice goes through the roof. More people than ever before are more and more convinced that the only reason that Asian Americans, especially in this case Japanese Americans, the only reason they came to this country was to spy, was to be sabotaged, was to hurt America in some way, and that they're just waiting on the signal to hurt America. The fear is that, once again, we've talked about this before, the fear is that immigrants will be more loyal to their homelands than they are to the US. So after the bombing on Pearl Harbor, very, very quickly, FDR signs Executive Order 9066, which we'll talk about in our document discussion, but you just clue yourself in here that this is where you should slot that information. And it results in internment, i.e. imprisonment, of roughly 120,000 Japanese Americans. These are both first generation immigrants from Japan, but also second generation Japanese American citizens, people who were born here, American citizens. Okay. So when internment happens, this is kind of the process. They were given 72 hours notice, 3 days, to sell everything that they had. They were allowed to take only what they can carry, only what they can pack in a suitcase. So, okay, 72 hours notice to sell your home, your car, your business. Everyone knows that you have 3 days to sell all of those things. Do you think that you're going to get fair market value for those? No. So right off the bat, Japanese Americans lose a lot of money, lose a lot of capital, lose a lot of investment. These are people who have worked very hard for a very long time to accrue all of that money to invest in their homes or cars or businesses, and now it's gone. Either they don't sell it at all because their neighbors know that it's just going to be abandoned soon anyway, or they're sold for way below market value. So right off the bat here, we have a lot of loss of capital. After they're given 72 hours notice, they pack up what they can carry in a suitcase or two. They go down to register themselves. These registration centers were at sometimes train depots, sometimes bus stations. They were given a number. That number was written on a tag and pinned to their shirt collar. They were sent inland to camps, and the camps looked something like this. They were housed in hastily constructed army barracks. They were in the middle of nowhere. They're surrounded by armed guards and watchtowers and barbed wire. Does that sound familiar? It should. This is almost exactly the process that was happening in Germany against the Jews and others during World War II. Really, the only difference is that instead of tattooing a number into their skin, Americans just pinned it to their shirt collar. So well done there, I guess. Obviously, the only other difference is there's no mass graves. Or is there? Conspiracy theories. So it's not great. America, right off the bat, even at the time, nobody is there aren't any illusions that what American federal government is doing is eerily similar to what the German government is doing. People are making those connections even in the 1940s, even while internment is happening. But it's seen as a necessary evil. There is so much prejudice against Asians. So many people are so completely convinced that the only reason that Japanese American immigrants came to America is to hurt America. that internment is allowed to go ahead. Nobody pushes back. There's no due process. There's no judge or trial or jury. These people haven't committed any crimes, but they are being sent to prison nonetheless. And they go willingly. At the time, there's no fighting back against the police. The Japanese Americans aren't rioting in the streets. You know, there is a court case that happens later, but not for several years. At the time, there's no pushback from Japanese Americans. And the reason why has to do with Executive Order 9066. So again, slot that information there in here. But in that executive order, FDR is making it clear that the only reason that internment camps are happening is because it's seen as this is something that's necessary to win the war. It's seen as a military need, a military necessity. And so the Japanese say, well, okay, if this is what America needs to win the war, then that's what we'll do. Japanese Americans move into the camps willingly, without fighting back, without rioting in the streets, in an effort to prove their loyalty to the United States. Since FDR has come out and said this is what Americans need, this is what America needs to do to win the war, the Japanese say, okay, if you're so worried that we're disloyal, let's prove otherwise. And so they go into the camps. And interestingly, the first thing that they do in the camps is try to recreate American culture. Even in this really barren, harsh image on the left, what's the first thing we see? They run up the flag. They have in these camps PTA groups in kindergartens, and they're forming their own baseball teams and their own Boy Scout troops. Like, dear God, what's more American than a baseball and the Boy Scouts? Not much. So where's my apple pie, right? So they're trying to prove their Americanness and their loyalty to America. One camp that I want to mention specifically was Amatchi, Colorado, not too far from us here in Oklahoma. This was the nice camp, quote unquote. Amatchi, Colorado was one of the first camps built and was closed only at the end of the war. So throughout the entire time of U.S. involvement from January of 42 to the end of the war in 1945, people were living at Amatchi. So many people were living there that overnight it became Colorado's 10th largest city, and it was only 1 square mile. As you can kind of see here in this image, people were housed in hastily constructed barracks. This is what the inside of those looked like. I'm sorry for the glare because I wasn't allowed in the building. I was taking this picture through the through the window. The doors were locked. The wall, this was a recreated barrack at the time, what it would have looked like. So the walls are tar paper, the floors are brick. The only electricity is a single bare light bulb on the ceiling. There's no air conditioner in Colorado. There is one pot-bellied stove, wood stove for heat. That's helpful. And the only furniture that they were given was a single army cot. This is a 20-foot by 20-foot room. That 20-foot by 20-foot room was supposed to house an entire family of 6. There's no kitchen, there's no bathroom. That's their only furniture, the little army cot. This is the nice camp. What do the bad camps look like? Ooh. The camps are very overcrowded, very miserable living. But even at Amatchi is important because it's, again, even at Amatchi, as rough as it is, the first thing that the Japanese Americans who were interned there try to do is help the war effort. Interestingly, Amatchi, Colorado was the only internment camp that was completely self-sustaining. Most of the people who were housed there, imprisoned there, had been farmers and horticulturalists in California. And so the first thing they start doing is farming and ranching. They grow all of their own food and meat. And the surplus they give, don't sell it, they give it to the military. It goes straight to the war effort. They're trying to feed soldiers. So not only does the military not have to spend any money on their upkeep, but they get free food. The other thing that happens at Ameche is there was a family of Japanese Americans who had been screen printers in Colorado. And so the first thing they do when they get to Ameche is they start trying to set up a screen printing shop. And so a lot of the posters that we saw in our earlier lecture, like Rosie the Riveter and the WWII campaign and all those, were printed at Ameche. They were printed inside an internment camp. Japanese Americans who are being imprisoned during the war are helping the war efforts. They are printing propaganda for the military. The first thing that Japanese Americans do when they get to the camps is try to prove their loyalty. They do anything that they can to prove their loyalty. We said that at the time there's no pushback. During the 1980s, there is a court case, Korematsu versus the United States. Let's just take a moment for that. Like, how cool must it be to sue the U.S.? If you're suing the country, it goes straight to the Supreme Court, of course. So Korematsu versus the United States, suing the United States for internment, for wrongful imprisonment, and everything else that happens. And the Supreme Court comes out and says, you know what, you're right. They find against the United States, and the United States is required to give a formal public apology and $20,000 in reparations money to every survivor. So if we're thinking about the ideas of reparations, what do you think about that? Reparations is something that gets brought up a lot. Should American federal government formally and publicly apologize and give any sort of money, any sort of recompense to survivors of past crimes and wrongdoing? They had to for the Japanese. Some people say, yeah, that's good, that's good. Some people say $20,000 for a survivor 40 years later. Most of those people are already dead. $20,000 is just a drop in the bucket compared to everything that they lost. And you also have 4 years that they can't get back of their life. It's too little too late, right? But then, the opposite thing that comes, the comeback is, well, that's more than African Americans have ever got. That's more than Native Americans have ever got. At least they got something. So the idea of reparations is something that gets brought up a lot every once in a while, even in today's world, 21st century. And so this is an important precedent for us to think about. So our last group of people who were influenced greatly by World War II is Native Americans. Native Americans during World War II. Native Americans also served in very high numbers per capita. Lots of servicemen enter the military, roughly 65,000. Native Americans face a unique challenge during World War II and in the years after. Towards the end of World War II, American federal government was involved in this cool little science project called the Manhattan Project. The goal of the Manhattan Project was to create a nuclear bomb. And spoiler alert, they do. They complete a nuclear bomb. During all of the experimentation and research, the researchers are creating a lot of nuclear radioactive waste and hazardous material, as you might imagine. Now, they know that, they're smart scientists, they're smart people, they're not dumb. They know that radioactive material is dangerous and that it will hurt a body, but they don't really know any of the specifics. How much radiation does a person have to be exposed to over what period of time, and what will it do to you, and how much and how little, and all of those sorts of nitty-gritty questions they don't know. And so the American federal government decides to perform a fun little side science experiment. And they very deliberately put all of the waste removal sites directly next to Native American reservations across the West. It's not an accident. They purposefully they know they've got to poison somebody, so they purposefully poison Native Americans. Most damningly at Hanford, Washington, with the Yakima Reservation. The Yakima Nation Reservation near Hanford, Washington, nuclear testing site and waste removal site. They, for 8 years, put radioactive material in the ground, in the water supply, in the air for 8 years without telling anyone. When it finally comes out and, third-party scientists are sent in to run some tests, they find that the amount of radiation that the Yakima Nation had been exposed to over that 8 years was 10 times that, which caused the Chernobyl meltdown. So if we know about Chernobyl, I hope your eyes just bugged a little bit. For those of us who don't, Chernobyl is a former Soviet testing site in the Ukraine now. That something went wrong. Something went very, very wrong, very, very quickly. And the people in Chernobyl were told, get out immediately. Don't pack, don't walk, run, get out. And so they do. And they just, there's all these pictures and things about people who like got the summons when they had sat down to dinner and they just leave dinner and they just run. And so the Chernobyl meltdown was so problematic that even now today, like people can't go in there, people can't live there. Except people are still living in the Yakima reservation. They have 10 times the level of radiation that caused that meltdown. So the Yakima people have a lot of incredibly high rates of cancer, of thyroid problems. There's all these weird stories about fish being born in the river with 3 eyes. It's really a health problem, a health hazard at Yakima and at other places across the West. Over here on the right side of the slide, we have a painting by Bunky Echo Hawk. Bunky, B-U-N-K-Y, Echo Hawk, just like it sounds, Echo Hawk. He is a Pawnee and Yakima native artist, and this is one of his paintings that he created, part of the gas mask series. The gas mask series. So we did a whole series of these paintings with gas masks. So what do we see here? In the back, there's a city on fire. The city on fire. The fire plumes are supposed to look like running buffalo, which I thought was really interesting. Like there's its head, there's its hump body, head, body, get it? So city on fire in the back. We see this kind of wasteland in the foreground. And then in the very foreground, there are Native Americans. And we know they're Native Americans because they're wearing all of their regalia, but we can't see them because they're wearing these hazmat suits and their gloves and their gas masks. They have the bison skull with the the hazard symbol on it. They're wearing these gas masks and these hazmat suits because their land is unsafe. Their area is unsafe. They're having to cover up. They're trying to protect themselves. But they're also wearing their native regalia. So what's the message here? Native Americans are still here, despite all, despite everything that the American federal government and military has done to Native Americans. They're still here, and they're still adapting, and they're still fighting, and they still exist, and their culture will continue to exist. You can't kill culture. The message here is supposed to be one of persistence, one of determination. Native Americans are still here. They still exist. They're still fighting. Like I said, spoiler alert, the Manhattan Project is successful. They created a nuclear bomb. Hope we knew that. FDR is the president who began the Manhattan Project, but unfortunately, he died in office. So he never sees the end of the war. His vice president, Harry Truman, ascends to the presidency upon his death. Interestingly, FDR didn't really like Truman. I don't know what that's about. FDR didn't really like Truman. One historian famously quipped that FDR treated Truman like a mushroom. He kept him in the dark and fed him a lot of shit. Not my words. FDR didn't tell Truman about the Manhattan Project. It was so secret that even the vice president didn't know because FDR didn't really like him, didn't really trust him with that information. So when Truman ascends to the presidency, he has one heck of a learning curve. he suddenly is approached by these scientists and these congressmen and say, hey, we have this incredible weapon of immense, unheard of power. What do you think we should do with it? There is a lot of work and effort and time that Truman spends learning about the Manhattan Project and trying to decide what to do with the bomb. There's a lot of discussion. Should we use it? Should we just test it? Should we just demonstrate it? And maybe that will be enough of a fear factor for Japan to back down. Ultimately, he decides, as I hope you know, to use the bomb. There's a couple of things that go into his decision to use the bomb. Let's take them backwards here. First and foremost, he and others are looking ahead to the end of the war, and it's pretty clear that Europe is done, right? They've been decimated by 2 back-to-back world wars. They're done. And so the only superpowers that are going to be left in the world are the Soviet Union and the United States. Soviet Union doesn't have the bomb yet. US wants to intimidate the Soviet Union. There's also this sense that, well, hey, Congress has already spent the money. They appropriated money for this science project. They don't know what it was. We already have the bomb. Why do we build it if we're not going to use it? Okay. First and foremost, overall, though, Truman decides to use the bomb because it's a way to quickly end the war and save American lives. His best military intelligence at the time is telling him that Japan is not going to surrender no matter what, that to try to force a surrender from Japan would require an invasion, which would, at best, conservative estimate, cost 10,000 American lives. 10,000 American lives. 10,000 American families ripped to shreds. Truman wants to avoid that. So he drops the bomb. He makes a decision to drop the bomb on August 6th at Hiroshima, Japan. Hiroshima is a civilian city. It has a war industry in it, but he drops the bomb in a civilian city. Japan is immediately reeling. With hindsight, we can see that the bomb is so devastating that, and it for them came out of left field, right? This was their Pearl Harbor. The bomb was so devastating and so unexpected that Japan just was reeling and needed a minute to get their ducks in a row, and they were getting ready to surrender. They wanted to surrender. They were trying to surrender. But before they could actually do it, Truman made the decision to drop a second bomb on August 9th on Nagasaki. 3 days later, and Japan immediately surrendered. On the slide here, we've got a couple of pictures to kind of help us wrap our minds around the atomic bomb. We've probably all seen an image similar to this one or one similar to the one on the left. This is the aftermath of the bombing of Hiroshima, the famous, infamous mushroom cloud. But like, that's too big for me. How do you wrap your brain around that? What's more important, I think, is what's happening underneath the mushroom cloud, what's happening on the ground. That's what this picture on the right is trying to get at. This is a picture of a little girl's metal lunchbox. There was, in Hiroshima, when the first bomb was dropped, a kindergarten girl who was walking into school and was caught in the blast, and the only thing left of her was her metal lunchbox in her backpack. The rest of her was just vaporized. This is how her family knows that she was killed. That's the real cost of the atomic bomb. Historians, with the advantage of hindsight, look at the August 6th bombing and have a really hard time condemning Truman for it because he's trying to save American lives. Best military intelligence is telling him that conservative estimate, he's looking at losing 10,000 American lives. And that's hard to argue with. Historians are a little more willing to critique Truman for the dropping of the second bomb. If he'd have just waited one more day, Japan would have surrendered. Maybe not even a full day. Some would argue. Some argue it wouldn't have even taken a full day. and a lot more Japanese citizens would not have been vaporized. And even still, even today, like we see at Yakima, a lot of Japanese are dealing with the fallout with the radioactive material, with all of the health problems associated with that. For our purposes in here, the end of one war is the start of another war. The important thing about the bombing of Nagasaki is that the moment that bomb drops, World War II is over, but the Cold War begins. Just like Truman was worried about, people were looking forward to the post-war world. What is it going to look like? And sure enough, the US and the Soviet Union are the only two superpowers left in the world. Europe needs a minute. So the map of Europe looks kind of like this. Over on the right side of the slide, we see the Soviet Union in yellow, and over here in yellow, there's all of these satellite states, as they were called, the Soviet sphere of influence. And then in Western Europe, in green. It does seem, looking at the map, like there is a clearly demarcated line between the Soviets and the rest of European. All of these countries in green have freedom, have liberty, have voting rights, have a voice in their government, have freedom of information. All of these Soviet states in yellow do not have any of those things. That clearly demarcated line came to be called the Iron Curtain. The Iron Curtain, a symbolic idea, symbol, separating freedom and unfreedom, liberty and tyranny, freedom of information and freedom to vote, and places where none of that was happening. So the Cold War abroad. Over here on the left side of the slide, we see some important milestones for American foreign policy. I have them listed here chronologically so you can kind of see how things played out, but we're not going to necessarily talk about them chronologically. We got kind of two themes that we're going to discuss. So first, the Truman and Dulles doctrines. American foreign policy. In 1946, right after the end of the war in 45, Truman was reelected in his own right, and he immediately faces a crisis in Greece and Turkey, these two countries down here towards the bottom of the map. As we can see, they are not communist, and Truman wants to make sure that they are not communist. Greece and Turkey, like most of the rest of Europe, were devastated after the war. They are facing a falling economy. There was a lot of fear that Greece and Turkey were going to experience a communist revolution. Truman wants to keep that from happening, and so in March of 47, he established the Truman Doctrine. The Truman Doctrine laid out three things, three important ideas. First, the idea of the domino theory. American foreign policymakers had this idea that if one country fell to communism, then the next would fall, and the next would fall, and on and on and on. It was just like hitting a stack of dominoes. Like you all played that little game where you pile up dominoes side by side, and you hit one and they all fall. The domino theory, if one country falls to communism, then they all will. In order to keep that from happening, American foreign policy, Truman Doctrine says, number 2, is that American is going to make it its foreign policy to contain communism. So the idea of containment. They can't attack communism where it already exists, they think. But the Truman Doctrine lays out the idea of containing communism where it already exists. Don't let it spread. Don't let those dominoes fall. And so the third thing the Truman Doctrine does most practically is that it gives aid to Greece and Turkey. It bolsters their economy so that they don't take over, don't experience a communist takeover, and they don't fall to communism. So if Turkey doesn't fall, then Greece doesn't fall. And if Greece won't fall, then Italy won't fall. And if Italy doesn't fall, then Sweden, on and on and on. None of them fall to communism. So the Truman Doctrine, three important things: domino theory, containment, and then most practically, giving aid to Greece and Turkey so they don't experience a communist revolution. A few years later, unfortunately, dun dun dun, October 1949, China experiences a communist revolution. Suddenly, it seems like the Truman Doctrine isn't doing enough. Suddenly, it seems like the Truman Doctrine is no longer working. China's a big country. That's a lot of area on the map that has suddenly gone red. China has a very large population. That's a lot of people that they've lost. China represents a lot of trade money, both importing and exporting. So China seems like a big loss to American foreign policymakers. Suddenly it seems like Truman Doctrine isn't doing enough, which leads to, after a few years, 1952, Secretary of State John Foster Dulles created the Dulles Doctrine. Sidebar, there's two Dulles doctrines in this era, two different Dulleses. Stay off the internet. We're talking about this one. Secretary of State John Foster Dulles in 1952 created the Dulles Doctrine, which essentially said Truman Doctrine isn't doing enough. It's not enough to just contain communism. Containment is no longer working. We need to attack communism. Defense is no longer working. We need to go on the offense. We need to attack. So now, according to the Dulles Doctrine, Americans' foreign policy will be to attack communism anywhere they find it in the world. Anywhere. So if we're looking ahead to our next module, 1960s, this sets up America's involvement in Vietnam. Oh, dun, dun, dun. So the Truman Doctrine and the loss, quote unquote loss, the fall of China, and the Dulles Doctrine that occurs after it, that's kind of our one theme that we can discuss with all of these. One foreign policy theme. Another thing that's happening in foreign policy is the arms race. America has the bomb before the end of the war in August 1949. I should change this. It's not Russia yet. Sorry. I don't know what made me think of that. Soviet Union has the bomb and the arms race begins. These two countries, the Soviet Union and the US, basically just engage in one-upsmanship. They say, well, if you have the atomic bomb, then I need the atomic bomb. And if you have the atomic bomb too, then I need a bigger, better bomb. And so they create the hydrogen bomb. Well, if you have an H bomb, I need an H bomb. Well, if you have one, I need two. If you have two, I need three. And then on and on and on, right? We get it. Until, here's a startling statistic, until 1955. When those two countries together had enough atomic weaponry to destroy the world 20 times. In case the first 19 don't cut it. These two countries together by 1955, the middle of the decade, like that's not even very far after this. By 1955, those two countries have enough atomic weapons between them to completely implode the globe 20 times. That's the definition of overkill. That is entirely too much. The arms race creates a culture of fear for everybody around the globe, but for our purposes, Americans. Americans are growing up, are living in a constant state of fear and a constant state of mutually assured destruction. They were afraid of these two countries getting mad. Get it? Haha. Gallows humor at its finest. They were afraid of these two countries getting mad. MAD, mutually assured destruction. Everybody knows that if one side pushes the button, then the other side is going to push the button, and it's all going to go back and forth until the apocalypse. As it happens, the world got very close to the apocalypse. In late October 1962, the Cuban Missile Crisis occurred. So Cuba, a small island country off the coast of Florida, not too far from Florida. What is it, 90 miles or something similar? Cuba in the early 1960s, experienced a revolution under Fidel Castro. We might have heard that name. Fidel Castro was not immediately communist, like it's not a communist revolution, but he pretty quickly becomes communist. And so the Soviets say, hey, Fidel, old buddy, old pal, can we put a nuclear missile site in your country? And he says, sure. So the Soviets have a nuclear missile site in Cuba pointing at Washington, D.C. As you might imagine, the U.S. is not pleased. And so they put a nuclear missile site on their military base in Turkey and pointed straight towards Moscow. So that's it. That's the missile crisis. It's a Mexican standoff. Who's going to shoot first? The Soviets have missiles in Cuba pointed at the US. The US has missiles in Turkey pointed at the Soviet Union. This begins a very intense week and a half of espionage, of sabotage, of negotiation and diplomacy between these two countries. Everybody's really stressed. Everybody is trying to get both of those missile sites removed. Like I said just a while ago, it gets really close to complete annihilation. Nobody knows it at the time, but with the years later, a lot of Soviet documents were declassified, and news gets out that there was actually a Soviet submarine off the coast of Washington, D.C. With a nuclear missile, and they were given orders to fire. They were given orders to nuke the U.S. The nuclear code on that submarine was split into three, and they were each piece of the code was given to the three top commanding officers, highest ranking officers on that submarine. So they all had to agree to like type in their part of the code to fire. The first two officers say, well, okay, we're soldiers in a time of war. We have been given an order. Let's go. And the third guy says, let's just wait. Let's just wait a minute. And so he encourages is the word I'm going to use. I don't know how it planned out, but encourages the other two to wait it out for a few days. Unfortunately, he did, because after, during that waiting period, after a few hours of that, the two sides, Soviet Union and the US, come to an agreement, and both missile sites are removed from both sites in Turkey and Cuba. But that's like it. That's how close we got. So thank you, random Soviet man, for being so calm and giving it a minute for diplomacy to pan out. Because if he hadn't, the world would have been destroyed. And none of us would be here. I wouldn't have been born. So next thing, last thing, the Cold War at home. So we just talked about like some foreign policy. Now let's talk about what's happening with the Cold War at home in America. A couple of things that we might discuss here. First, the kitchen debates, which is part of one of our document readings. But I do want to show you this photo. Richard Nixon in the dark suit and is at the time Vice President of the United States. And over here on the left, our left, his right, is Nikita Khrushchev, who is the Soviet premier at the time. The Americans and the Soviets in 1959 had a pair, like a matched set of exhibitions in each other's country. The Americans had the American exhibition in Moscow, and the Soviets had the Soviet exhibition in New York City. And these exhibitions were kind of analogous to like today's state fairs. Like, you go to the state fair and there's a midway of fun stuff, but there's also a building where you can walk through and see vendors and see exhibits, a lot of exhibits. And both of these American and Soviet exhibits had the same goal. They had model homes of each of their countries, and they were trying to convince the other side that their society was better. So if we're thinking about what the Cold War was all about, this is it. It's not a Cold War. It's not a hot war. That's my joke for the day. It's not a hot war. It's never the US and the Soviet Union facing each other against a battlefield and shooting guns at each other. It's a war of ideas. It's a war of ideology. Both sides think that they have the better economic system. The United States is capitalist. The Soviet Union is communist. What do those words mean? Capitalism is based on private ownership. So private individuals own land, own their home, own businesses, small businesses or large businesses in the case of large companies, right? It's private ownership. So if the name of the game is private ownership, then some individuals are going to own more than others. Classes exist in a capitalist society. People are wealthy and people are poor. We've talked a lot about that in our discussions this semester. And also under capitalism, because private individuals are supposed to own stuff and kind of work for themselves, and the government doesn't owe you anything. The government doesn't owe you a house, or it doesn't owe you a job, it doesn't owe you an education, college education. That is all very different to a communist society. Communist society is communist, communal. It's based on public ownership. So the government owns most of the land and utilities and most of the businesses. People own private property, like a toothbrush, stuff. But but the big stuff is all publicly owned. And because of that, it's ideally on paper a classless society. Everybody is roughly equal. There are no very, very wealthy and very, very poor people. A classless society, everybody is roughly equal, which means that the government does owe individual citizens something. They do guarantee a job, they do guarantee a place to live. So communist versus capitalist society, the Cold War is about which of these two societies is better, which of these two societies is going to be the model for the rest of the world. And the American and Soviet exhibitions are trying to prove that their side is the best in all of these ways. We've talked on the last slide about how the arms race meant that Americans and everybody else was living in a culture of fear. These fears took on different forms for kids and adults. So a lot of kids' fears circled around nuclear annihilation and something that, the idea that at any given moment could be your last. And so the federal government put out my favorite cartoon character of all time. That's only slight sarcasm. Bert the Turtle. Bert the Turtle is this cute little turtle with his little army hat. Then he taught kids to duck and cover. And so if you have 5 minutes to waste, I really encourage you to get on YouTube and look up the duck and cover video. The idea was that kids would, when they heard the air raid siren, they would duck and cover. They would get under their desk in school and they would get in the fetal position and put their arms over their heads. And that was going to save them from nuclear annihilation. Right, absolutely. No kid believes this, right? One of my professors, kind of elderly professors at OSU when I was getting my doctorate, he lived in Arizona about a mile from a missile silo. And so they did these air raid drills all the time. And he remembers that when he was in elementary school, they'd do these duck and cover drills and the kids would just be laughing and joking and making complete fun of it because they knew. They were old enough to know that this was not actually going to help save them from nuclear annihilation. But that's not the point, right? Why does the government put out these duck and cover drills with our cute little Bert the Turtle friend? That way you have a plan. It calms you down if you have a plan. We have plans for other crises. If there's a fire, we have a drill. We know what to do. If there's a tornado, we have a drill. We know what to do. We have something to do, a procedure that will help, maybe not completely solve, ideally solve the problem, but at least it's going to help you. That bar of helping is a little bit high perhaps, but it makes younger kids at least feel like they have a plan, like they have something to do. It's like helps them stay calm psychologically. So Bert the Turtle, the duck and cover drill. Another thing that Americans were afraid of, most American adults were really concerned with communist invasion. What's it going to look like if, not when, not if, whatever, the communists invade and take over. And so on May Day, May 1st in 1950, in the town of Mosney, Wisconsin, the townspeople all got together and staged a fake communist takeover. They said to themselves, what's it going to look like when, not if, the communists take over? So May Day, May 1st, 1950, the town of Mosney, Wisconsin holds a fake communist takeover and they invite the world press in and they film it all. And they have this little video, this little black and white video of what's going to happen. And they say, well, the incoming regime is going to take away and march out of town or imprison anybody who could help. So the former administrators, the former government and politicians, the former police, they're all going to be gone. They're going to march out of town anyone unfavorable to the new regime. So people like the priests or the preachers, and, you know, communism is against religion, so can't have those people in town. They're kicked out. In Mazani, they say that since it's a classless society, everybody is going to be roughly equal, which means people are probably going to be poor. They have a bread line and they have a housing development. So the government owes you something, but it's not going to be something that's very good. So Mazani, Wisconsin, a fake communist takeover. Americans are trying to prepare themselves for the worst. During the Cold War, there's this cultural fear that children and adults are living with. So, okay, I know that was a really long lecture video. Thank you for sticking with it. Well done, props. And I hope you have a good rest of your day. Bye-bye.